The Red Tower by Thomas Ligotti. The ruined factory stood 3 stories high in an otherwise featureless landscape. Although somewhat imposing on its own terms, it occupied only the most unobtrusive place within the grey emptiness of its surroundings, its presence serving as a mere accident upon the desolate horizon. No road led to the factory, nor were there any traces of one that might have led to it at some point in the distant past. If there had ever been such a road, it would have been rendered useless as soon as it arrived at one of the 4 red-bricked sides of the factory, even in the days when the facility was in full operation. The reason for this was simple. No door had been built into the factory. No loading dock or entranceway allowed penetration of the outer walls of the structure, which was solid brick on all 4 sides without even a single window below the level of the 2nd floor. The phenomenon of a large factory so closed off from the outside world was a point of extreme fascination to me. It was almost with regret that I ultimately learned about the factory's subterranean access. But of course, that revelation in its turn also became a source of my truly degenerate sense of amazement, my decayed fascination. The factory had long been in ruins, its innumerable bricks worn and crumbling, its many windows shattered. Each of the 3 enormous stories that stood above the ground level was vacant of all but dust and silence. The machinery, which had densely occupied the 3 floors of the factory, as well as considerable space beneath it, is said to have evaporated. I repeat, evaporated, as soon as the factory ceased operation, leaving behind only a few spectral outlines of deep vats and tanks, twisting tubes and funnels, harshly grinding gears and levers, giant belts and wheels that could be most clearly seen at twilight, and later on, not at all. According to these strictly hallucinatory accounts, the whole of the Red Tower, as the factory was known, had always been subject to fadings at certain times. This phenomenon, in the delirious or dying words of several witnesses, was due to a profound hostility between the noisy and malodorous operations of the factory and the desolate purity of the landscape surrounding it, the conflict occasionally resulting in temporary erasures or fadings of the former by the latter. Despite their ostensibly mad or credulous origins, these testimonies, it seemed to me, deserved more than a cursory hearing. The legendary conflict between the factory and the greyish territory surrounding it may very well have been a fabrication of individuals who were lost in the advanced states of either physical or mental deterioration. Nonetheless, it was my theory, and remains so, that the Red Tower was not always that peculiar colour for which it ultimately earned its fame. Thus, the encrimsoning of the factory was a betrayal, a breaking off, for it is my postulation that the ancient structure was in long-forgotten days the same pale hue as the world which encompassed it. Furthermore, with an insight born of dispassion to the point of total despair, I envisioned that the Red Tower was never solely devoted to the lowly functions of an ordinary factory. Beneath the 3 soaring stories of the Red Tower were 2, possibly 3 other levels. The one immediately below the 1st floor of the factory was a nexus of the unique distribution system for the goods which were manufactured on all 3 floors above. This subterranean level in many ways resembled and functioned in the manner of an old-fashioned underground mine, Elevator compartments closed by heavy wire mesh, twisted and corroded, descended far below the surface into an expansive chamber which had been crudely dug out of the rocky earth and was haphazardly penetrated by dense structures of supports and criss-crossing networks of posts and pillars, beams and rafters that included a variety of metals, woods, concrete, bone, and a fine sinewy webbing that was fibrous and quite firm. From this central chamber radiated a system of tunnels that honeycombed the land beneath the grey and desolate country surrounding the Red Tower. Through these tunnels, the goods manufactured by the factory could be carried, sometimes literally by hand, but more often by means of small wagons and carts, reaching near and far into the most obscure and unlikely delivery points. The trade that was originally produced by the Red Tower was in some sense remarkable, but not, at first, of extraordinary or especially ambitious nature. This was a gruesome array of goods that could perhaps best be described as novelty items. In the beginning, there was a chaotic quality to the objects and constructions produced by the machinery at the Red Tower, a randomness that yielded formless things of no consistent shape or size or apparent design. Occasionally, there might appear a peculiar ashen lump that betrayed some semblance of a face or a clawing finger, or perhaps an assemblage that looked like a casket with tiny irregular wheels. But for the most part, the early productions seemed relatively innocuous. After a time, however, things began to fall into place, as they always do, rejecting a harmless and uninteresting disorder, never an enduring state of affairs, and taking on the more usual plans and purposes of a vicious, intent creation. So it was that the Red Tower put into production its new, more terrible and perplexing line of unique novelty items. Among the objects and constructions now manufactured were several of an almost innocent nature. These included tiny, delicate cameos that were heavier than their size would suggest, far heavier, and lockets whose shiny outer surface flipped open to reveal a black, reverberant abyss inside, a deep blackness roaring with echoes. Along the same lines was a series of lifelike replicas of internal organs and physiological structures, many of them evidencing an advanced stage of disease, and all of them displeasingly warm and soft to the touch. There was a fake, disembodied hand on which the fingernails would grow several inches overnight, and intensely grew back should one attempt to clip them. Numerous natural objects, mostly bulbous gourds, were designed to produce a long, deafening scream whenever they were picked up or otherwise disturbed in their vegetable stillness. Less scrutable were such things as hardened globs of lava, into whose rough and igneous forms were set a pair of rheumy eyes that perpetually shifted their gaze from side to side like a restless pendulum. And there was also a humble piece of cement, a fragment broken away from any street or sidewalk, that left a most intractable stain, greasy and green, on whatever surface it was placed upon. But fairly simple items were eventually followed, and ultimately replaced, by more articulated objects and constructions. One example of this complex type of novelty item was an ornate music box that, when opened, emitted a brief gurgling or sucking sound in an emulation of a dying individual's death rattle. Another product manufactured in great quantity at the Red Tower was a pocket watch in a gold casing, which opened to reveal a curious timepiece, whose numerals were represented by tiny, quivering insects, while the circling hands were reptilian tongues, slender and pink. But these examples hardly begin to hint at the range of goods that came from the factory during its novelty phase of production. I should at least mention the exotic carpets, woven with an intricate abstract pattern that, when focused upon for a certain length of time, composed themselves into fleeting, phantasmagoric scenes of a kind which might pass through a fever-stricken or even permanently damaged brain. As it was revealed to me, and as I have revealed to you, the means of distributing the novelty goods fabricated at the Red Tower was a system of tunnels located on the first level, not the second or possibly the third, that had been excavated below the 3-story factory building. It seemed that these subterranean levels were not necessarily the foundation of the original plan of the factory, but were in fact a perverse and unlikely development that might have occurred only as the structure known as the Red Tower underwent, over time, its own mutation from some prior state until it finally became a lowly site for manufacturing. This mutation apparently demanded the excavation, whether from above or below I cannot say, of a system of tunnels as a means of distributing the novelty goods which, for a time, the factory produced. As the unique inventions of the Red Tower achieved their final forms, they seemed to be assigned specific locations to which they were destined to be delivered, either by hand or by small wagons or carts pulled over sometimes great distances through the system of underground tunnels. Where they might ultimately pop up was anyone's guess. It might be in the back of a dark closet, buried under a pile of indistinguishable junk, where some item of the highest and most extreme novelty would lie for quite some time before it was encountered by sheer accident or misfortune. Conversely, the same invention, or an entirely different one, might be placed on the night table beside someone's bed for near immediate discovery. Any delivery point was possible. None was out of the reach of the Red Tower. There has even been testimony, either intensely hysterical or semi-conscious, of some items from the factory being uncovered within the shelter of a living body, or one not long deceased. I know that such an achievement was within the factory's powers, given its later production history, but my own degenerate imagination is fully captured by the thought of how many of those monstrous novelty goods produced at the Red Tower had been scrupulously and devoutly delivered solely by way of these endless underground tunnels to daringly remote places where they would never be found, nor ever could be. Truly, the Red Tower worked in mysterious ways. Just as a system of distribution tunnels had been created by the factory when it developed into a manufacturer of novelty goods, an expansion of the system was required as entirely new phases of production gradually evolved. Inside the wire mesh elevator compartment that provided access between the upper region of the factory and the underground tunnels, there was now a special lever installed, which, when pulled back or possibly pushed forward, I don't know the details, enabled one to descend to a second subterranean level. This latterly excavated area was much smaller, far more intimate than the one directly above it. It could be observed the instant the elevator compartment came to a stop, and a full view of things was attained. The scene, which now confronted the uncertain mind of witnesses, was in many ways like that of a secluded graveyard, surrounded by a rather crooked fence of widely spaced pickets held together by rusty wires. The headstones inside the fence all closely pressed against one another, and were quite common, though somewhat antiquated in their design. However, there were no names or dates inscribed on these monuments. Nothing at all, in fact, with the exception of some rudimentary and abstract ornamentation. This could be verified only when the subterranean graveyard was closely approached, for the lighting at this level was dim and unorthodox, provided exclusively by the glowing stone walls encompassing the area. These walls seemed to have been covered with phosphorescent paint, which bathed the graveyard in a cloudy, greyish haze. For the longest time, how long I cannot say, my morbid reveries were focused on this murky vision of a graveyard beneath the factory. A subterranean graveyard surrounded by crooked picket fences and suffused by the highly defective illumination given off by phosphorescent paint applied to stone walls. For the moment I must emphasize the vision itself, without any of the consideration paid to the utilitarian purposes of this place, that is, the function it served in relation to the factory above. The truth is that at some point all the factory's functions were driven underground to this graveyard level. Long before the complete evaporation of the machinery in the Red Tower, something happened to require the shutdown of all operations in the 3 floors of the factory which were above the ground level. The reasons for these actions are deeply obscure, a matter for contemplation only when a state of hopelessness and devouring curiosity has reached its height, when the burning lights of speculation become so intense that it threatens to incinerate everything on which it shines. To my own mind, it seems entirely valid to reiterate at this juncture the long-standing tension that existed between the Red Tower, which I believe was not always stigmatized by such a hue and such a title, and the greyish landscape of utter desolation that surrounded the structure on all sides, looming around and above it for quite incalculable distances. But below the ground level of the factory was another matter. It was here that its operations at some point retreated. It was here, specifically, at this graveyard level, that they continued. Clearly the Red Tower had committed some violation or offence, its clamouring activities and unorthodox products, perhaps its very existence, constituting an affront to the changeless quietude of the world around it. In my personal judgment, there had been a betrayal involved, a treacherous breaking of a bond. I can certainly picture a time before the existence of the factory, before any of its features blemished the featureless countryside that extended so grey and so desolate on every side. Dreaming upon the greyish desolation of the landscape, I also find it quite easy to imagine that there might have occurred a lapse in the monumental tedium, a spontaneous and inexplicable impulse to deviate from a dreary perfection. Perhaps even an unconquerable desire to risk a move towards a tempting defectiveness. As a concession to this impulse or desire out of nowhere, as a minimal surrender, a creation took place, and a structure took form where there had been nothing of its kind before. I picture it, at its inception, as a barely discernible eruption in the landscape, a mere sketch of an edifice, possibly translucent when making its first appearance, a grey density rising in the greyness, embossed upon it in a most tasteful and harmonious design. But such structures or creations have their own desires, their own destinies to fulfill, their own mysteries and mechanisms which they must follow at whatever risk. From a grey and desolate and utterly featureless landscape, a dull edifice had been produced, a pale, possibly translucent tower, which, over time, began to develop into the factory, and to issue, as if in the spirit of the most grotesque belligerence, a line of quite morbid, quite wonderfully disgusting novelty goods. In an expression of defiance, at some point it reddened with an enigmatic passion for betrayal and perversity. On the surface, the Red Tower might have seemed a splendid complement to the greyish desolation of its surroundings, making a unique, picturesque composition that served to define the glorious essence of each of them. But in fact, there existed between them a profound and ineffable hostility. An attempt was made to reclaim the Red Tower, or at least to draw it back towards the formless origin of its being. I am referring, of course, to that show of force which resulted in the evaporation of the factory's dense arsenal of machinery. Each of the 3 stories of the Red Tower had been cleaned out, purged of its offending means of manufacturing novelty items, and the part of the factory that rose above the ground was left to fall into ruin. Had the machinery in the Red Tower not evaporated, I believe that the subterranean graveyard, or something very much like it, would nonetheless have come into existence at some point or another. This was the direction in which the factory had been moving, a fact suggested by some of its later models of novelty items. Machines were becoming obsolete as the diseased mania of the Red Tower intensified and evolved into more experimental and even visionary projects. I have previously reported that the headstones in the factory's subterranean graveyard were absent of any names of the interred and were without dates of birth and death. This truth has been confirmed by numerous accounts rendered in borderline gibberish. The reason for these blank headstones is entirely evident, as one gazes upon them standing crooked and closely packed together in the phosphorescent haze given off by the stone walls covered with luminous paint. None of these graves, in point of fact, could be said to have anyone buried in them whose names and dates of birth and death would require inscription on the headstones. These were not what one might call burying graves. This is to say that these were in no sense graves for burying the dead, quite the contrary. These graves were of a highly experimental design, from which the newest productions of the Red Tower were to be born. From its beginnings as a manufacturer of novelty items of an extravagant nature, the factory had now gone into the business of creating what came to be known as hyper-organisms. These new productions were also of a fundamentally extreme nature, representing an even greater divergence on the part of the Red Tower from the bland and grey desolation in the midst of which it stood. As implied by their designation as hyper-organisms, this line of goods displayed the most essential qualities of their organic nature, which meant, of course, that they were wildly conflicted in their two basic features. On the one hand, they manifested an intense vitality in all aspects of their form and function, but on the other hand, and simultaneously, they manifested an ineluctable element of decay in these same areas. To state this matter in the most lucid terms, each of these hyperorganisms, even as they scintillated with an obscene degree of vital impulses, also and at the same time had a degeneracy and death written deeply upon them. In accordance with a tradition of dumbstruck insanity, it seemed the less said about these offspring of the birthing graves, or any similar creations, the better. I myself have been almost entirely restricted to a state of seething speculation concerning the luscious particularities of an all hyper-organic phenomena produced in the subterranean graveyards of the Red Tower. Although we may reasonably assume that such creations were not to be called beautiful, we cannot know for ourselves the mysteries and mechanisms of, for instance, how these creatures moved throughout the hazy luminescence of that underground world, what creaky or spasmic gestures they might have been capable of executing, if any, what sounds they might have made, or the organs used for making them, how they might have appeared when awkwardly emerging from deep shadows or squatting against those nameless headstones, what trembling stages of mutation they almost certainly would have undergone following the generation of their larvae upon the barren earth of the graveyard, what their bodies might have produced or emitted in the way of fluids and secretions, how they might have responded to the mutilation of their forms for reasons of an experimental or entirely savage nature. Often I picture to myself what frantically clawing efforts these creations probably made to deliver themselves from their confining environment, which their malformed or non-existent brains could not begin to understand. They could not have comprehended, any more than I can, for what purpose they were bred in those graves, those incubators of hyperorganisms, minute factories of flesh that existed wholly within and far below the great factory of the Red Tower. It was no surprise, of course, that the production of hyperorganisms was not allowed to continue for very long before a second wave of destruction was visited upon the factory. This time, it was not merely the fading and ultimate evaporation of machinery that took place. This time it was something far more brutal. Once again, forces of ruination were directed at the factory, specifically the subterranean graveyard located at its second underground level, its 3-story structure that stood above the ground having already been rendered an echoing ruin. Information on what remained of the graveyard, and of its clearly blasphemous works, is available to my own awareness only in the form of shuddering and badly garbled whispers of mayhem and devastation and wholesale sundering of the most unspeakable sort. These same sources also seem to regard this incident as the culmination, if not the conclusion, of the long-standing hostilities between the Red Tower and that greyish halo of desolation that hovered around it on all sides. Such a shattering episode would appear to have terminated the career of the Red Tower. Nevertheless, there are indications that, appearances to the contrary, the factory continues to be active despite its status as a silent ruin. After all, the evaporation of the machinery which turned out countless novelty items in the 3-story red brick factory proper, and the ensuing obsolescence of its sophisticated system of tunnels at the first underground level, did not prevent the factory from pursuing its business by other, more devious means. The work at the second underground level, the graveyard level, went very well for a time. Following the vicious decimation of those ingenious and fertile graves, along with the merchandise they produced, it may have seemed that the manufacturing history of the Red Tower had been brought to a close. Yet there are indications that below the 3-story, above-ground factory, below the first and second underground levels, there existed a third level of subterranean activity. Perhaps it is only a desire for symmetry, a hunger for compositional balance in things, that has led to a series of the most vaporous rumours anent this third underground level, in order to provide a kind of complementary proportion to the 3 stories of the factory that rise into the grey and featureless landscape above ground. At this third level, these rumours maintain, the factory's schedule of production is being carried out in some new and strange manner, representing its most ambitious venture into the output of putrid creations, ultimately consummating its tradition of degeneracy, reaching towards a perfection of defect and disorder, according to every polluted and foggy rumour concerned with this issue. Perhaps it seems I have said too much about the Red Tower, and perhaps it has sounded far too strange. Do not think that I am unaware of such things. But as I have noted throughout this document, I am only repeating what I have heard. I myself have never seen the Red Tower. No one ever has, and possibly no one ever will. And yet, wherever I go, people are talking about it. In one way or another, they are talking about the nightmarish novelty items, or about the mysterious and revolting hyper-organisms, as well as babbling endlessly about the subterranean system of tunnels and the secluded graveyard whose headstones display no names and no dates designating either birth or death. Everything they are saying is about the Red Tower in one way or another, and about nothing else but the Red Tower. We are all talking and thinking about the Red Tower in our own degenerate way. I have only recorded what everyone is saying, although they may not know they are saying it, and sometimes what they have seen, though they may not know that they have seen it. But still, they are always talking, in one deranged way or another, about the Red Tower. I hear them talk of it in everyday life, unless, of course, they begin to speak about that grey and desolate landscape, that hazy void in which the Red Tower, the great and industrious Red Tower, is so precariously nestled. Then the voices grow quiet, until I can barely hear them, as they attempt to communicate with me in choking scrapes of post-nightmare trauma. Now is just such a time when I must strain to hear the voices. I wait for them to reveal to me the new ventures of the Red Tower, as it proceeds into even more corrupt phases of production, including the creation of beings turned out by the shadowy workshop of its third subterranean level. I must keep still and listen for the voices. I must remain quiet for a terrifying moment. Then I will hear the news of the factory starting up its operations once more. Then I will be able to speak again of the Red Tower.